Broadly speaking, a negotiator is faced with a fundamental choice as to whether to pursue a hard bargaining strategy or to pursue a softer bargaining strategy, whether to hold out for a really ambitious outcome or whether to be prepared to settle for a much less attractive outcome. Now, this choice about hard and soft, about when to dig your heels in and when to allow yourself to be pushed backwards, is a very difficult choice to make. There's always the risk that you aren't pushing hard enough, in which case you aren't maximising the outcomes for your own side, and where the consequences of doing that mean that you face real problems with the people that you represent, that you have not been an effective agent for your principles, and that you may have problems in terms of justifying the position that you've taken. On the other hand, if you make the wrong choice in the opposite direction and you push too hard and you hold out for too ambitious a target, then it may well be that the outcome is that you are unable to achieve those outcomes, having raised expectations, that the price that your principals have to pay in order to achieve that outcome, or even to attempt to achieve that outcome, are greater than the benefits that you provide, and that again, you have a real problem in justifying your stance, your choice of strategy. So it's a delicate balancing act, a really delicate balancing act, and it represents a dilemma, that the negotiator's dilemma is represented between a cautious strategy, where the chances are that you're able to walk away with at least something. Even if it's a fairly minimal gain, at least you may be able to come back and say, well, here, I got you something. It may not be everything that we wanted, but it is at least something. Or to pursue a much bolder strategy, where if you are faced with an opponent who is also pursuing and committed to a bold strategy, that you're going to face yes, the potential for a big payoff, but also the potential for very high costs. You know, potentially that default position that Walton and McKersey talk about. That a hard bargaining strategy from your side that meets a hard bargaining strategy from the other side means that you're going to face some real difficult conflict, and that in order to get what you want, you're both going to have to fight in a really serious way. So how can we make some reasonable choices about the choice of hard and soft strategies? Is it possible at the outset to determine which strategy is preferable? Can we make any reasonable and rational approaches? Well, to some extent, an awful lot of our choice of strategy will be determined by our understanding of the position on the ground. What is the objective strength of our side against their side? Is their side vulnerable in some way? If I'm a union negotiator, am I aware of the organisation's need to satisfy a particular customer or a particular client, or that there are certain time pressures, or maybe we know that their stocks of a particular element are running low, which means that a very sharp withdrawal of labour at a particular point in time can have a disproportionate effect. On the other side, maybe we're aware that if I'm a management negotiator, that the union's position is quite weak. Maybe they don't have much in the way of strike funds to be able to support their membership with any kind of sustained strike. So we know that we can operate with a fair degree of freedom because we know that the other side isn't in a position to hurt us very much. So intelligence, our understanding of the position of the other side, that basic position of bargaining strength is very important to be able to understand. So, having your ear close to the ground, to be aware of the context in which negotiations are taking place. Those kinds of things need to be fully exploited and made use of and built in to our plans for our bargaining position. Outside of that, there are a couple of broad approaches that we can use in order to try and influence our bargaining opponent. Because what we want to avoid, as much as we possibly can, is for our opponent to be able to take a hard bargaining strategy. Because if our opponent is able to commit to a hard bargaining strategy, that doesn't leave us very many options about where to go in response to that. Because, for example, our bargaining opponent is committed to a hard bargaining strategy. Our choice then is to mirror that strategy, for example, and we know that the chances then, the likelihood is that we're both going to incur quite extensive costs as we dig in our positions and we attempt to hurt each other in order to pursue that hard bargaining strategy to try and achieve our ambitious targets. So on the one hand, the opponent has a hard strategy, they're committed to it, we follow suit, and we're both going to suffer costs as a result. So the alternative is they committed to a hard strategy, we then respond with a soft strategy. We will give way, we will compromise extensively. And so we'll have to take an awful lot of hits on our side of the bargaining table and probably walk away with not very much, if anything at all. So you can see that there's a real advantage in being able to establish a hard strategy because it forces your opponent into a particular situation. The same thing can be achieved by reducing the chance of a hard strategy by your bargaining opponent. If you can steer them into taking a soft strategy, then it makes it much less valuable for you to bargain soft and much more potentially valuable to bargain hard. Because if you've got a fair degree of certainty that they aren't going to adopt a hard position, then you are able to operate with very little risk. If you bargain hard, you can go in and take the majority of the resources that are available for bargaining, and you suffer very little chance of them incurring much in the way of cost on you. That's not necessarily a very easy thing to do. It's very hard to alter the bargaining position of anybody else. How can you convince them that they should bargain soft when they know that their interests will ultimately be served by bargaining hard? So what you can do as a bargainer, and what we see bargainers doing all of the time, is to attempt to convince their opponent that they are in fact committed to a really hard strategy, that they aren't going anywhere. And so you see that the behaviour of bargainers is driven by this desire to convince their opponents that as a bargainer, they aren't backing down. And that leading into negotiations, they're not talking about compromises, they're not talking about giving way, they're talking about quite ambitious targets, they're bigging up their position in order to convince their opponent that they are not going anywhere else apart from the most ambitious targets that they possibly can. Because by doing so, they then force their opponent to respond. They force their opponent to consider, what am I going to do in response to this? Do I establish a hard bargaining position as well and risk all of those costs? Or would it be better maybe to compromise, to soften my position? And so we see this game between bargainers who attempt to get their hard strategy in first, and that they are attempting to play mind games with each other, doing the poker face, building the narrative around their bargaining position So that despite the fact that bargainers all know that this is what they're all doing, they're attempting to psychologically strengthen their position and weaken the position of their opponent. And that they play these games setting out their targets, setting out the expectations of both their own side and their bargaining opponents in order to strengthen their opponent's belief in their commitment to a particular bargaining position. We'll talk about these commitment strategies another time, but the key strategic element is to gain the high ground, to gain that strategic advantage of the other side being convinced, or at least have serious doubts about whether they will move from that hard bargaining strategy.